Dune is a story that's been passed on for generations, and like the stories of older cultures, it hasn't been passed on verbatim. Dune has been translated to the screen roughly once each generation since the book first found its audience in 1965. And because the book isn't the only transmission medium, it's not a story that was simply written down and remained static. Many in my age range first encountered Dune through the David Lynch film in 1984. Though I vastly prefer the Alan Smithy cut. It tells the same story, but it makes changes, some of them quite significant. And there are a lot of people who have seen that movie but have not read the book. And that's important when looking at Dune in the context of the wider modern culture. More people have seen a film version of the story than have read the book, and only a tiny slice of people have read all the books. I am not part of that slice. Here I'm interested in Dune, not in terms of its complete lore as laid down by Herbert, but in terms of its place in our own culture and how the popular perception of the story changes over time. Some of those movie changes were transitory, while others became permanently part of the pop culture Dune lore, became part of the story as far as cultural transmission is concerned. The most obvious example of this is probably the Spacing Guild. The 1984 and 2000 productions both explicitly depict the Guild navigators as having mysterious powers to fold space, and most people I've discussed Dune with over the decades go with this assumption. But it comes from the Lynch film. In the book, it's implied that the spice gives the navigators the mental ability to calculate chaotic higher dimensional space to guide the ship. But the ship itself is what makes the actual travel possible via some sort of machinery. They are navigators in the truest sense, not a mystical propulsion system in their own right. A similar thing is done with the weirding way, which in the book is just a Fremen term for Bene Gesserit techniques they don't understand, but the '84 film transforms it into a sonic combat art.
My name is a killing word.
That line is one of the iconic Dune things that I've heard people reference over the decades. But it's peculiar to this one film adaptation. And while some people despise this edition, I think it's an interesting, if blunt, take on one of the core themes.
Some thoughts have a certain sound, that being the equivalent to a form.
Words can be weapons. They can communicate or distort ideas. They can create stories, and stories shape perception. Paul and Jessica use the story of the voice from the outer world to their advantage, a story nurtured by the Bene Gesserit for centuries, both as a safety mechanism should any of their people ever be in the deserts of Arrakis and in need of aid from the Fremen, but also as a mechanism of social control. One of the surest ways to control a potentially rebellious population is to give them a Messiah story, get them to believe in a savior who will come and lead them to salvation. Someday. Be patient. But weapons can be wielded by many hands. Jessica takes that story and manipulates it, with Villeneuve's Dune films doing the best job of bringing that to the screen. Paul, too, recognizes the need to craft his image. It's part of his determination to be accepted fully by the Fremen, part of why he must ride Shai-Hulud. But he also knows that the story can take on a life of its own. It can run away with its participants. This is the thing that haunts him. He sees where the story goes. War across the galaxy, the death of trillions. The voice from the outer world comes to tell his own story, and it's composed of killing words. This is present in every iteration of Dune, but it's presented in different ways. The book has not only the narrative to work with, but excerpts from in-world sources. Does the prophet see the future, or does he see a line of weakness? A fault or cleavage that he may shatter with words or decisions as a diamond cutter shatters his gem with a blow of a knife. Private Reflections on Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan. There's the idea of words shaping reality, of ideas, of truth being dependent on words. My father once told me that respect for the truth comes close to being the basis for all morality. Something cannot emerge from nothing, he said. This is profound thinking if you understand how unstable the truth can be. From Conversations with Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan. And Lynch, some would say builds on it, others would say dumbs it down, but he makes it less subtle by turning it into an actual weapon. I certainly don't want a gun I have to talk to, but a story can use metaphors that serve its goal without them having to make practical sense. Whatever the case, people remember it. They remember the killing words, and in that sense, Lynch's change was successful at conveying one of Dune's core concepts. The 2000 production, written and directed by John Harrison, pushes this into the background a bit and takes its own liberties with aspects of the story. For example, adding a meeting between Paul and the Princess Irulan early on. But it plays down these elements so much that it almost becomes the hero's journey that Frank Herbert tore down. In many ways, it's the most faithful adaptation, bringing me to the many depictions of the Baron Harkonnen. The most recent film depicts the Baron in a rather demonic light. He's this creepy, pale-skinned thing that rises up from a pool of black oil, ponderous and slow, but exuding malignance like an anthropomorphized cancer. Lynch's Baron was grotesque and over the top, covered in pustules while laughing maniacally and flying around the room. In contrast, Harrison's production depicts the Baron as a flashy, pompous glutton, which is most consistent with how he's described in the book. He wore a yellow cape that bulged over his portable suspensors. The fat cheeks were two cherubic mounds beneath spider black eyes. Or this. His jowls bobbed up and down, the suspensors jiggled and shifted beneath his orange robe. Rings glittered on his hands and opifires shone where they had been woven into the robe. Harrison's production gives the most faithful depiction based on these descriptions, but it's also worth noting that we can all get different mental images of characters from reading a book, sometimes in contradiction to how the character is described. My own image of the Baron Harkonnen persists, even though the previous passage proves it's not how the book describes him. I recently read the book yet again, and my own image of the Baron hinges on references to Harkonnen uniforms being blue. Only 8 splotches of blue, the bodies of the Sardaukar in Harkonnen uniforms, remained at the scene of violence, and 1 or 2 other lines of that sort. In my head, I took the blue uniform, coupled with gluttonous corrupt aristocrat and murderous warmongering regime, and for decades my mental image of Baron Harkonnen has been a levitating Hermann Goering. He's ostentatious, corrupt, a caricature of self-serving avarice. But he's a man. He fits the image of a possible head of a wealthy neo-feudal house rather than a hell-spawn apparition. The latest Dune adaptation is generally grittier and more grounded in its design than the previous efforts, but in that sense a more human, sort of Nazified Baron Harkonnen presiding over a totalitarian, over-industrialized Gidi Prime would seem to fit. And while Villeneuve leans into this a bit in Part 2, I wonder if part of introducing the Baron as a demonic entity is a recognition that giving us merely a corrupt, psychopathic plutocrat would just be too mundane these days, because the world is run by them already. It used to be hidden better, but now it's evident to anyone paying attention that there's Harkonnens everywhere. It's also worth noting that the book signals the immorality and corruption of the Baron in several ways, one of them being homosexuality. It was the 60s, cultural boundaries were different. Judge it in the context of its time. But today they need to shift that, conveying this idea of malice and moral decay without referencing politically divisive topics in our own world. It's a good move. The audience should be thinking about the politics of Arrakis and the Empire, not the ambient baggage of the modern world. At least, not until they finish the book or leave the theater, having taken in the entirety of Herbert subverting the hero's journey into a warning. Dune keeps reminding us that Paul isn't some man of the people. He's a prince in what is in many ways a post-apocalyptic society. Just as the collapse of the Roman Empire led to centuries of feudalism in our history, Dune's system is a result of an earlier fall from greater heights. Of course, it's not straight-up feudalism. Dune takes place within an interstellar industrial society. Economically, it's a strange beast, but socially, it's essentially feudal. Society is divided into hereditary ranks within the framework of the Feudalesque class structure, summarized as a place for every man and every man in his place. Paul Atreides was born into the top of that class structure. Dune is a story of kings and princes, along with their inner circle of trusted advisors and companions. Most of us have more in common with the peons, the peasants of the Dune universe, who spend their lives on a single planet doing whatever work the ruling house of that planet requires of them. Herbert wants us to notice this. We like Paul on one level. He's young, naive, he sees his subordinates, Thufir, Duncan, and Gurney, as family. We relate to his anger at the Harkonnens for the death of his father. It's a very personal conflict. But it's also about the loss of his birthright of power and wealth. The Atreides are the good guys, but only by comparison. Duke Leto treats the Fremen with respect, but it's not just out of human decency. He wants to turn them to his side, to have them as a military ally. The Atreides could be the villains in a different story. They're not cardboard laughing sadists, but they're rigid authoritarians prepared to enforce that authority. That doesn't change with Paul. Only the goals shift. He uses a different army in a different story, but he's still an aristocrat ruling through divine right, sending people to fight for his goals. Dune isn't a story about good guys versus bad guys, but rather one about how individuals can change the world, and not always for the better. That good intentions or a righteous cause aren't enough. Consequences matter. But perhaps even more than that, Dune, through its multiple iterations, reminds us that all stories are a collaborative act. Films, obviously, but even the written word is a sort of collaboration between the writer and the reader. No one that has ever read Dune has exactly the same story in their heads as Frank Herbert had in his. We all have separate worlds in our own heads, and communication is always imperfect. And that matters because ideologies, the framework of beliefs that our personal philosophies and civilizational structures are built on, are stories. Whatever voice from the outer world you follow, it's a story that someone else is telling. Whether it's someone like Paul Atreides, fired up on anger and injustices done to him, or more like a carefully crafted Bene Gesserit prophecy, we're all an audience interpreting someone else's stories. And because Dune so deeply engages that, I think it'll endure. It'll continue to be retold, repackaged, and reinterpreted. Frank Herbert's story has transcended merely being entertainment or a marketable franchise. It's become part of our cultural heritage, and as such, it's more than a copyrighted IP. It almost doesn't have a strict canon anymore because the core story has been and will continue to be retold with numerous variations. I recognize those might be killing words for some. While Star Wars and Star Trek have both been referred to as modern mythologies at various times, neither has fully crossed over from franchise to fable, a story that is retold rather than added to or merely ripped off, shifting details across generations but staying true to its core. Dune has done this, and I suspect that 100 years from now, there is going to be some iteration of Dune that's widely enjoyed and discussed by people who don't even know it was a book from the mid-20th century, while Star Wars will be something that only their great-grandpa has ever seen. And in that sense, I think we dodged a bullet with Jodorowsky's Dune.